I remember that day as if it were etched into my heart. I was only 6, living in a small house on the outskirts of Boston with my parents and older brother, Tommy. Our home wasn't much, peeling paint on the walls, creaky floorboards that groaned with every step, but it was ours. Or at least it had been, until Dad lost his job at the factory and Mom's hours at the diner got cut back. That morning started like any other. I woke up to Mittens purring beside me on my bed, her warm little body curled against my side. She was a tabby with the softest gray fur and these bright green eyes that seemed to understand everything. Dad had found her by the dumpster behind our apartment building the year before, tiny and scared. I nursed her back to health with bits of tuna and bowls of milk, wrapping her in my favorite blanket at night. She became my best friend, my confidant, the one I whispered all my secrets to when no one else would listen. But that morning was different. I noticed the hushed voices coming from the kitchen as soon as I opened my eyes. Mittens stretched and looked at me, almost like she knew something was wrong too. I pulled her close, burying my face in her fur before padding barefoot across the cold floor to peek around the corner. Mom was at the table, her head in her hands. Dad stood by the window, staring out with his shoulders slumped forward in a way I'd never seen before. There were papers scattered across the kitchen table, bills with big red stamps on them. I didn't know what they meant then, but I understood the heaviness in the room, the way it seemed to press down on all of us. "We've got to make some hard choices, Ellie," Dad said to Mom, his voice cracking. "The electric company's threatening to shut us off, and we're 2 months behind on rent." Mom looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. "We've already sold everything worth selling, Jack. What else can we do?" I clutched Mittens tighter, and she meowed softly. That's when they noticed me standing there. "Morning, sweetheart," Mom said, quickly wiping her eyes and forcing a smile. "You hungry? We've got some cereal left." I nodded, but I couldn't stop looking at those papers, at the worry lines creasing Dad's forehead. "Is everything okay?" I asked, already knowing the answer. They exchanged a look, the kind adults think kids don't understand. "We're just figuring some things out," Dad said, ruffling my hair as he walked past. "Nothing for you to worry about." But later that afternoon, I overheard them talking about the community fair happening on Saturday at Franklin Park. People from all over the neighborhood would be there selling homemade goods, secondhand clothes, toys, anything to make a few extra dollars. "Maybe we could sell some of Sarah's old toys," Mom suggested. "She's outgrowing them anyway." "We already sold most of them last month," Dad replied, defeat heavy in his words. "There's not much left except." Their eyes drifted to Mittens, who was playing with a ball of yarn in the corner. My heart froze. "No," Mom whispered. "She loves that cat." "I know," Dad said, his voice breaking. "But we're running out of options, Ellie. We need to put food on the table." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, tears streaming silently down my face as I stroked Mittens' fur. She purred contentedly, oblivious to what was coming. The weight of my family's struggles pressed upon my tiny shoulders. My tummy had been growling more often lately. I'd noticed Mom giving me her portion of dinner more than once, claiming she wasn't hungry. But I knew better. The next morning, I made a decision that no 6-year-old should ever have to make. I found a cardboard box and lined it with my softest sweater. I placed Mittens inside with her favorite toy mouse and carried it to the kitchen where Mom was stirring a pot of watery oatmeal. "I want to help," I said, my voice small but determined. "We can take Mittens to the fair." Mom turned, her face crumpling as she knelt down to hug me. "Oh, baby, no. We'll figure something else out." But there was nothing else. We both knew it. The days leading up to the fair were a blur of preparations and heartache. I spent every moment with Mittens, memorizing the way her whiskers twitched when she was dreaming, how she always needed my lap before settling down for a nap. I told myself that whoever bought her would love her just as much as I did, that she'd have a good home with plenty of food and toys. But the thought of never seeing her again made it hard to breathe. Friday night, I couldn't eat dinner. The lump in my throat was too big, choking me with unshed tears. Dad tried to reassure me, telling me that we might not even have to sell her, maybe we'd make enough money from our other items. But the hope in his words didn't reach his eyes. I went to bed early that night, Mittens curled up beside me as always. I whispered promises to her, stroking her soft fur until my fingertips memorized every inch of her. In that moment of despair, I felt a mixture of fear and determination. The thought of separating from my kitty was unbearable, yet I knew there was no other way. Even as my heart broke, a small spark of hope flickered deep inside me, urging me to stay brave despite the overwhelming sadness. "I love you, Mittens," I whispered as she purred, her eyes slowly blinking in that way cats do when they trust you completely. "I'm so sorry." In my dreams that night, I imagined a world where we didn't have to make such terrible choices, where families could keep their beloved pets even when times got tough. But morning came too soon, sunlight streaming through my window as if it were any ordinary day, as if my heart wasn't about to shatter into a million pieces. The morning of the fair dawned bright and clear, which felt like a cruel joke. The world should have been gray and raining to match the storm in my heart. I got dressed slowly, pulling on my cleanest jeans and the red sweater Grandma had knitted for me last Christmas. Mom had said we should look our best, that people were more likely to buy from folks who seemed tidy and respectable. Tommy helped Dad load our card table and folding chairs into our rusty station wagon while Mom carefully placed our meager offerings into cardboard boxes, Dad's old records that he'd treasured for years, Mom's collection of costume jewelry, a few of Tommy's outgrown sports trophies. I carried Mittens in her box, whispering soothing words as she mewed nervously. She didn't like car rides. Franklin Park was bustling by the time we arrived. Colorful tents and makeshift stalls lined the grassy area near the zoo entrance. The smell of popcorn and cotton candy drifted from food vendors, making my empty stomach growl. Children ran laughing between the rows, their faces sticky with treats I knew I couldn't ask for. Parents haggled over prices of used bikes and video games while teenagers clustered around a small stage where local bands would play later. "Over here looks good," Dad said, pointing to an empty spot between Mrs. Kowalski selling homemade pierogies and the Jacksons with their table full of hand-me-down clothes. We set up quickly, arranging our items as attractively as possible on our worn tablecloth. Mom made a small sign, "Family sale. Every purchase helps." Dad couldn't meet anyone's eyes as he placed his beloved vinyl records on display. Tommy kicked at the grass, hands shoved deep in his pockets, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. And me? I sat on a small folding chair with Mittens in my lap and a hastily made sign propped against our table, "Kitty for sale, $20. The price had been a subject of heated whispers the night before. Dad thought we could get $30, but Mom worried no one would pay that much. I didn't care about the money. I just wanted whoever took her to love her as much as I did. The morning crawled by in excruciating slowness. Dad sold 3 of his records for $5 each, wincing as each one was carried away. Mom sold a necklace her own mother had given her for $10, turning away to wipe her eyes when she thought no one was looking. Tommy managed to sell his soccer trophies to Mr. Reynolds, who owned the sporting goods store on Main Street, and said he'd display them in his window. A few people stopped to admire Mittens. Mrs. Chun from the Chinese restaurant down the street scratched her behind the ears and told me what a beautiful cat she was. Old Mr. Grady, who lived in the apartment above ours, paused to ask why I was selling such a fine Mauser. I couldn't answer him, just hugged Mittens closer and shook my head. "Don't worry, kiddo," he said gruffly, patting my shoulder. "The right home will come along." By noon, the sun was high and hot. Tommy had wandered off to find his friends, and Dad was deep in conversation with some other laid-off factory workers, their voices low and serious. Mom brought me a paper cup of water from the fountain and a half sandwich she'd packed for our lunch. "You doing okay, sweetie?" she asked, smoothing my hair back from my forehead. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Mittens had fallen asleep in my lap, trusting and peaceful. How could I explain to her that this might be our last day together? A group of kids from my school walked by, pointing and whispering. I recognized Becky Thompson and her friends, the popular girls who never talked to me anyway. But today, I saw pity in their glances, and somehow that was worse than their usual indifference. "Is it true your dad lost his job?" Becky asked, twirling her blonde ponytail around her finger. "My mom says your family might have to move." "Leave her alone," a voice cut in before I could respond. It was Charlie Martinez, a boy from my class who lived in the apartment next to ours. He stood with his hands on his hips, glaring at Becky until she shrugged and walked away with her friends. Charlie plopped down on the grass next to my chair. "Don't listen to them," he said. "My dad lost his job last year too. Things got better." I wanted to believe him, but the evidence of our desperation was spread out before us on that shabby tablecloth. "That your cat?" Charlie asked, reaching out to pet Mittens, who had woken up and was stretching languidly in my lap. "Her name's Mittens," I said, my voice cracking. "She's very good and doesn't scratch or anything." "Why are you selling her?" The question hung in the air between us, so simple and yet so impossible to answer without breaking down. Charlie seemed to understand my silence. "I'd buy her if I could," he said finally. "But my mom's allergic." He stayed with me for a while, just sitting quietly while I stroked Mittens' fur. It was a small kindness, but it meant everything in that moment. As the afternoon wore on, the fair grew more crowded. The local high school band started playing on the small stage, their slightly off-key rendition of Sweet Caroline causing the crowd to sing along. Normally, I would have enjoyed the festive atmosphere, but today every laugh and cheer felt like it was coming from very far away. Around 3 o'clock, a young couple stopped at our table. They were probably in their 20s, the woman heavily pregnant with a rounded belly stretching her floral sundress. "Oh, Mark, look at the kitty," she said, her face lighting up. "Isn't she adorable?" The man, Mark, smiled indulgently at his wife. "We talked about this, Jen. The apartment's barely big enough for us and the baby. But cats are so independent," Jen insisted, reaching out to stroke Mittens, who purred and leaned into her touch. "And just think how nice it would be for our little one to grow up with a pet." My heart raced. They seemed nice, like they would give Mittens a good home. But the thought of handing her over made me feel sick. "How much?" Mark asked, nodding at my sign. $20, I whispered. He reached for his wallet, but Jen was watching my face closely. Something in my expression made her pause. "Honey," she said softly to her husband. "I think maybe we should look around a bit more before deciding." Mark looked confused but nodded. "Sure, whatever you want." As they walked away, Jen glanced back at me and gave a small, sad smile. I think she understood what it would cost me to let Mittens go. The sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the park. Vendors started packing up their unsold goods. Our table was still half full. Dad had only sold 5 records in total, and most of Mom's jewelry remained untouched. "Maybe we should head home," Mom suggested gently. "We can try again next weekend." Part of me felt relieved that Mittens was still with me, but the tension in Dad's jaw told me our problems hadn't gone away. We still needed money for food and rent. This was just delaying the inevitable. As we began packing up our things, a shadow fell across our table. I looked up to see a tall man standing there, his expensive suit and polished shoes out of place among the casual fairgoers. Everything about him, from his perfectly styled dark hair to his confident stance, suggested he wasn't from our neighborhood or our world. "Excuse me," he said, his voice deep and cultured. "But is that cat still for sale?" Time seemed to slow as I looked up at the stranger. The setting sun cast a golden halo around his silhouette, making him appear almost otherworldly against the fading light of Franklin Park. I clutched Mittens closer to my chest, her warmth a small comfort against the chill that had suddenly settled over me. "Yes," my father answered, stepping forward with a mix of wariness and hope. "She is." The man's gaze shifted from my father to me, his eyes softening as they took in the sight of my small hands wrapped protectively around Mittens' gray fur. I noticed then that his eyes were an unusual color, almost amber, like Mittens' sometimes appeared in certain light. There was something in them that I couldn't quite name, a depth of understanding that seemed at odds with his pristine appearance. "I'm Andrew Blackwood," he said, extending a hand to my father. The name tickled something in my memory. I'd seen it somewhere before, maybe on the news or in the newspapers Mom sometimes spread across the kitchen table while looking for job listings. Dad wiped his palm against his worn jeans before shaking the man's hand. Jack Thompson. This is my wife Ellie, our son Tommy, and our daughter Sarah. Mr. Blackwood nodded politely to each of us before his attention returned to me, or rather, to Mittens. That's a beautiful cat you have there. What's her name? Mittens, I said softly, surprised I could speak at all. Because her paws look like she's wearing white mittens. A small smile touched his lips. Very fitting. May I? He gestured, asking permission to pet her. I hesitated, then nodded. Mr. Blackwood crouched down to my level, not seeming to care that his expensive pants were touching the dusty ground of the fairgrounds. He extended a hand slowly, allowing Mittens to sniff his fingers before gently scratching behind her ears. To my surprise, she purred immediately, pushing her head against his palm in a gesture of immediate trust. Mittens was usually wary of strangers. She likes you, I said, unable to keep the note of surprise from my voice. Animals often do, he replied, his focus still on Mittens rather than the growing discomfort of my parents, who shifted nervously beside us. I've always felt they can sense things about people that we humans miss sometimes. Tommy, who had been watching with typical teenage suspicion, cleared his throat. Are you actually interested in buying her, or what? Tommy. Mom hissed, but Mr. Blackwood didn't seem offended by my brother's bluntness. It's a fair question, he said, straightening to his full height. He must have been at least 6 feet tall, towering over even my dad. The answer is, it depends. On what? Dad asked, a slight edge to his voice. We'd been at the fair all day, and patience was running thin for all of us. Mr. Blackwood glanced around at our half-packed table, taking in the records, the jewelry, the other household items we'd been trying to sell. His gaze was analytical but not judgmental. It depends on why you're selling her. The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications. Dad's jaw tightened, and Mom looked away, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. It was one thing to sell your possessions out of necessity. It was another to have someone directly acknowledge that necessity. That's not really, Dad began, but I interrupted him. We need the money, I said plainly, meeting Mr. Blackwood's amber gaze. Dad lost his job at the Richardson factory when they moved production overseas, and Mom's hours got cut at Jenkins' diner. We have to pay rent, or we might lose our apartment. Sarah, Mom gasped, mortified that I would lay out our financial struggles so baldly to a complete stranger, especially one who clearly had no concept of what it meant to wonder where your next meal was coming from. But Mr. Blackwood didn't seem put off by my honesty. Instead, something flickered across his face. Recognition, perhaps, or memory. Richardson Manufacturing? On Westfield Avenue. Dad nodded stiffly. 18 years I gave them. Started on the line right out of high school, worked my way up to floor supervisor. Didn't matter in the end. Cheaper to make everything in China now. 18 years, Mr. Blackwood repeated quietly. That's a long time to give to a company. There was an odd tension in the air now, not uncomfortable, exactly, but charged with something I couldn't identify. The bustle of the fair continued around us, vendors finishing their packing, families heading to their cars, but in our little bubble of space, everything felt suspended. Mr. Blackwood reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a sleek leather wallet. My heart sank. This was it then. He was going to buy Mittens, and I would never see her again. I felt tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. The sign says $20, he said, looking at the crumpled piece of cardboard I'd made. That seems rather low for such a fine animal. Mom made a small noise of surprise. People at the fair had been haggling prices down all day, not suggesting they were too low. How much would you say she's worth? Mr. Blackwood asked, directing the question at me specifically. I looked down at Mittens, trying to calculate the incalculable. How could I put a price on her purrs, her playfulness, the comfort of her presence at night? She's worth everything, I whispered. Instead of laughing at my childish answer, Mr. Blackwood nodded as if I'd said something profound. Yes, I imagine she is. He turned to my parents. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, would you be willing to join me for a cup of coffee? There's a diner just across from the park entrance. I'd like to discuss something with you, if you have a few minutes. My parents exchanged confused glances. About the cat? Dad asked cautiously. About a number of things, Mr. Blackwood replied enigmatically. Sarah and Tommy are welcome to join us, of course. My treat. Tommy perked up at the mention of food. We hadn't eaten much all day, trying to save what little we had. We couldn't impose, Mom started, but Mr. Blackwood shook his head. It's no imposition. Please, I insist. There was something in his tone that made it difficult to refuse, not forceful, but gently compelling. Dad hesitated only a moment longer before nodding. All right, let us finish packing up here, and we can meet you there in 15 minutes. I'll help, Mr. Blackwood said, already rolling up his sleeves. Mom tried to protest, but he waved her off. Please allow me. Within minutes, our unsold items were packed away in their boxes and loaded into our station wagon. Mr. Blackwood worked efficiently despite his fancy clothes, handling Dad's records with respect and carefully wrapping Mom's jewelry in tissue paper to prevent tangling. As we walked toward Danny's diner, a greasy spoon we'd never been able to afford, I clutched Mittens to my chest, unsure what to expect. Mr. Blackwood walked beside me, shortening his stride to match mine. You know, he said conversationally, I had a cat when I was about your age. His name was Captain. Like a ship captain? I asked, curiosity momentarily overriding my anxiety. Exactly. He had these markings around his eyes that made him look like he was wearing a mask. Very dignified fellow. He smiled at the memory. He was my best friend during a rather difficult time in my life. Before I could ask what he meant by difficult time, we arrived at the diner. Mr. Blackwood held the door open for us, nodding politely as we filed in. The hostess, Patty, according to her name tag, raised her eyebrows at the sight of us, particularly at Mr. Blackwood in his expensive suit. Table for 5, please, he said pleasantly. And if it's not too much trouble, could we have one of the booths in the back? My young friend here has her cat with her, and I think it would be best if we weren't too disruptive to your other patrons. Patty looked like she wanted to object to the presence of Mittens, but something about Mr. Blackwood's polite yet firm demeanor made her simply nod and lead us to a corner booth. Your server will be right with you, she said, distributing menus before hurrying away. I slid into the booth with Mittens still in my arms, sandwiched between Mom and Tommy. Dad sat across from us, with Mr. Blackwood taking the outside seat. The vinyl squeaked beneath us as we settled in, and the smell of coffee and grease hung in the air. Please, Mr. Blackwood said, gesturing to the menus, order whatever you'd like. Tommy didn't need to be told twice, his eyes widening at the options. Mom tried to direct him toward the less expensive items, but Mr. Blackwood gently interrupted. Mrs. Thompson, I truly mean it. Whatever you'd like. Money is not a concern tonight. Our waitress, a tired-looking woman in her 50s with a name tag reading, Doris, approached with a pot of coffee. What can I get for you folks? After we'd ordered, pancakes for Tommy despite the late hour, burgers for Mom and Dad, and chicken fingers for me, with Mr. Blackwood requesting only coffee, a brief silence fell over the table. You're probably wondering why I've brought you here, Mr. Blackwood said finally, his hands clasped on the tabletop. Dad nodded cautiously. It did cross our minds. Mr. Blackwood's gaze traveled around the table, lingering momentarily on each of us before he spoke again. I should properly introduce myself. My name is Andrew Blackwood. I'm the CEO of Blackwood Innovations. Mom gasped softly. No wonder the name had sounded familiar. Blackwood Innovations was one of the largest technology companies in the country. Everyone knew the name, even in our working-class neighborhood. What is someone like you doing at a community fair in our neighborhood? Dad asked, unable to keep the suspicion from his voice. A shadow passed over Mr. Blackwood's face. I grew up not far from here, actually. On Cedar Street. Dad's eyebrows rose. Cedar Street was even worse off than our neighborhood, a place of rundown tenements and corner stores with bulletproof glass. You, Tommy blurted incredulously. Me, Mr. Blackwood confirmed with a small smile. Life can take unexpected turns, Tommy. Both for better and for worse. Our food arrived, and for a few minutes, conversation paused as we began to eat. I managed one-handed bites of my chicken fingers while still cradling Mittens, who had fallen asleep in my lap, oblivious to the strange encounter unfolding around her. Mr. Blackwood waited until we had all taken a few bites before speaking again. I was at the fair today because I make a point of visiting my old neighborhood regularly. It helps me remember where I came from. His gaze fell on me, gentle and understanding. And I couldn't help but notice a little girl with a cat for sale and the saddest eyes I've ever seen. The diner seemed to grow quieter as Mr. Blackwood spoke, though perhaps it was just that I was paying such close attention to his words. My fingers absently stroked Mittens' fur as I watched the strange man who had entered our lives so unexpectedly. 25 years ago, he continued, taking a sip of his coffee, I was in a situation not unlike yours, Sarah. His eyes met mine across the table. My father worked at a textile mill that closed down when I was 7. Within 6 months, we'd lost our apartment, most of our possessions, and nearly all our hope. I glanced at my parents, who were listening with careful, guarded expressions. Tommy had stopped mid-bite, his burger forgotten. We had a cat named Captain, as I mentioned. And like you, I had to make the decision to sell him during a community yard sale. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done. His voice had grown softer, almost distant, as if he were seeing that memory play out before him instead of our faces. What happened? I asked, unable to contain my curiosity. A sad smile crossed his face. I sold him to an elderly woman who needed companionship. She was kind, and she let me visit him sometimes, but it wasn't the same. That day taught me something I've never forgotten, that sometimes in life, the things that matter most can slip away because of circumstances beyond our control. Dad shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Blackwood, I appreciate you sharing that, but I'm not sure why. Please, call me Andrew, he interrupted gently. And I'm telling you this because when I saw Sarah today with Mittens, it was like looking at myself all those years ago. Some wounds heal, but they never disappear completely. His gaze moved to my father. And some losses we can prevent if we're in a position to help. A tense silence fell over the table. Mom's hand found mine beneath it, squeezing gently. What are you suggesting exactly? Dad asked cautiously. Andrew leaned forward slightly. Mr. Thompson, I'd like to make you an offer. Not charity, he raised a hand as Dad started to bristle, but an opportunity. One that would ensure Sarah doesn't have to part with Mittens, and that your family has the breathing room it needs right now. We don't need handouts, Dad said stiffly, though the dark circles under his eyes and the worn edges of his jacket told a different story. Jack, Mom murmured, casting a meaningful glance at Tommy and me. Andrew nodded as if Dad's pride was exactly what he'd expected. I understand. I felt the same way when people tried to help my family. But sometimes, the strongest thing we can do is accept help when it's offered, especially when it's for our children. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, sliding it across the table to Dad. Richardson Manufacturing was purchased by Blackwood Innovations 6 months ago. We're remodeling the factory and bringing production back to the United States, starting next month. Dad's eyes widened. What? We need experienced floor supervisors who understand both the local workforce and the production process. The position comes with full benefits and a salary 20% higher than what you were making before. If you're interested, that is. The shock on my parents' faces would have been comical in any other situation. Tommy kicked me under the table, as if making sure I was hearing the same thing he was. Why? Dad asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Why would you do this? Andrew's eyes softened. Because 25 years ago, no one was in a position to help my family. And I promised myself that if I ever had the means, I would be that person for someone else. He glanced at me, then back to my father. Consider it paying forward a debt I owe to the universe. Mom's eyes had filled with tears. This is... I don't know what to say. Say you'll consider it, Andrew replied. The factory reopens in 3 weeks. I'd like you to be part of that, Mr. Thompson. Dad's hands trembled slightly as he picked up the business card, running his thumb over the embossed lettering. Yes, of course I'll consider it. Thank you. But Andrew wasn't finished. He turned to Mom next. Mrs. Thompson, I understand you work at Jenkins' diner? Mom nodded, surprise evident on her face that he'd remembered this detail. We're opening a cafeteria in the renovated factory. We'll need someone to manage it, someone who understands food service and can handle a busy lunch rush. Would that be something that might interest you? A small gasp escaped Mom's lips. Are you serious? Completely. The positions are real, the needs are real, and your qualifications sound perfect for what we're looking for. His smile was warm but professional. I'm not offering charity, Mrs. Thompson. I'm offering jobs to qualified people who deserve them. Tommy, who had been quietly taking this all in, suddenly spoke. What about me? Do you have a job for a 14-year-old who's failing algebra? His tone was joking, but I could hear the hint of genuine curiosity beneath it. Andrew laughed, a rich sound that seemed to lighten the atmosphere. Not at the moment, no. But what I do have is a mentorship program for local students. It includes tutoring, college preparation, and summer internships at Blackwood Innovations for those who maintain their grades. We're always looking for bright young minds. Tommy's eyes lit up in a way I hadn't seen in months. For real? For real, Andrew confirmed. Though you'll have to bring that algebra grade up. I will, Tommy promised immediately. I totally will. Throughout this exchange, I had been sitting quietly, stroking Mittens and trying to make sense of what was happening. It seemed impossible, like something from one of the fairy tales Mom used to read me before our lives got so hard that bedtime stories became a luxury we couldn't afford. Andrew's attention finally returned to me. And as for you, Miss Sarah, he said, his voice gentle, I think Mittens should stay right where she is, don't you? Fresh tears sprang to my eyes, but these were different from the ones I'd been fighting all day. Yes, please, I whispered. Good. That's settled then. He reached across the table, his hand extended palm up. For a confused moment, I thought he wanted to shake my hand, but then I realized what he was doing. $20, I believe the sign said? Dad started to object, but Andrew held firm. I insist. Sarah put her cat up for sale fairly, and I'm making a purchase. Except in this case, I'm buying Mittens' continued residence with the Thompson family. A long-term boarding arrangement, if you will. Reluctantly, Dad nodded. I watched in stunned silence as Andrew placed 2 crisp $10 bills on the table. There's one more thing, Andrew said, his tone becoming more businesslike. Your rent situation. I understand it's urgent. Mom nodded, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. We're 2 months behind. The landlord has been patient, but would you allow me to take care of that as an advance against your first month's salary? Both of you would be starting at positions that warrant signing bonuses anyway. Dad's pride warred visibly with practicality on his face. Finally, practicality, and the thought of his family's security, won out. We would pay you back, he said firmly. Every penny. I have no doubt, Andrew replied with genuine respect in his voice. The rest of the meal passed in a blur of details and plans. Andrew explained more about the factory reopening, about the vision he had for bringing manufacturing jobs back to the community, about the mentorship program Tommy could join. Mom and Dad gradually moved from shocked disbelief to cautious optimism, asking thoughtful questions that Andrew answered readily. Through it all, I held Mittens close, hardly daring to believe that I wouldn't have to let her go. When it was time to leave, I found myself lingering behind as my parents and Tommy headed toward the door. Mr. Blackwood? I said quietly. He crouched down to my level, those unusual amber eyes meeting mine. Yes, Sarah. Thank you for saving Mittens, I said, my voice small but steady. And for helping my family. Something flickered across his face, a brief shadow of old pain, quickly replaced by gentle warmth. You're very welcome. But do you know something? I think perhaps it was Mittens who saved all of us today. How? I asked, genuinely confused. He smiled, reaching out to scratch gently behind Mittens' ears. If not for her, we wouldn't have met. And sometimes, Sarah, the most important moments in our lives come disguised as something else entirely. Today looked like an ending to you, but it was actually a beginning. As we walked out of the diner into the cool evening air, the weight that had been pressing down on my small shoulders for so long felt lighter somehow. Dad's step had more energy, Mom's smile came more easily, and even Tommy walked taller, already talking about getting his algebra grade up. The future, which had seemed so bleak just hours before, now stretched before us full of possibilities I hadn't dared to imagine. And through it all, Mittens purred contentedly in my arms, unaware that she had been at the center of a moment that would change our lives forever. In the parking lot, Andrew shook hands with my parents one final time. "I'll see you Monday morning at the factory for the paperwork," he said to Dad. 9 o'clock sharp. "We'll be there," Dad promised, a new determination in his voice. As Andrew turned to leave, heading toward a sleek black car that waited at the curb, I called after him impulsively. "Mr. Blackwood." He paused, looking back. "I hope you find another captain someday," I said, the words tumbling out before I could consider them. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face. "Thank you, Sarah. Perhaps I will." Then he slipped into his car and was gone, leaving us standing together in the gathering dusk, a family transformed by an encounter none of us could have predicted when the day began. The days following our meeting with Andrew Blackwood passed in a whirlwind of changes. Monday morning arrived with a nervousness I hadn't seen in my parents since my first day of kindergarten. Mom ironed Dad's best shirt 3 times, and Dad polished his work boots until they gleamed. Tommy even got up early to wish them luck, a minor miracle for a teenager who usually had to be dragged out of bed for school. "You look great," I assured them both as they fussed over their appearances in our tiny bathroom mirror. "Very professional." Mom smiled, kneeling down to hug me. "Thank you, sweetie. Now remember, Mrs. Miller from next door will check on you after school, and we'll be home by 6. "I know," I said, trying to sound grown up and not scared at all about being home without them for the first time in months. Since Dad had lost his job, at least one of my parents had always been around. "Mittens and I will be fine." As if hearing her name, Mittens sauntered into the bathroom and wound herself around Dad's legs, leaving gray fur on his freshly pressed pants. Instead of getting annoyed, Dad just laughed and bent down to scratch her head. "You keep an eye on things while we're gone, okay?" he told her seriously, and I could have sworn she meowed in agreement. After they left, the apartment felt strangely quiet. I got ready for school in silence, carefully packing my lunch, a peanut butter sandwich and an apple, and double-checking that Mittens had enough food and water for the day. It felt odd to be doing these things alone, but also a little exciting, like I was proving I could be responsible. School that day seemed to drag on forever. Ms. Petrowski called on me twice during math, and I didn't know the answers either time because my mind kept wandering to Dad and Mom at their new jobs. Would the other workers like them? Would their bosses be nice? Would they really get paid as much as Mr. Blackwood had promised? When the final bell rang, I raced home, half expecting to find Mom already there with news, but of course the apartment was empty except for Mittens, who greeted me with enthusiastic purrs. Mrs. Miller knocked on the door about 30 minutes later, bringing with her a plate of chocolate chip cookies and curious questions about my parents' new jobs. "It's at the old Richardson factory," I told her as she settled onto our couch. "The one that closed down. A new company bought it and they're hiring people again." "Well, isn't that something?" Mrs. Miller said, her eyebrows raised in surprise. "I hadn't heard anything about that. Must be keeping it quiet until they're ready to announce it properly." I nodded, not mentioning Mr. Blackwood or the strange way my parents had gotten their jobs. It felt like a special secret, something just for our family. The hours ticked by slowly. I did my homework at the kitchen table, fed Mittens her dinner, and was just setting the table for our own meal when I heard keys in the lock. Mom and Dad burst through the door, their faces flushed with excitement. "Sarah!" Mom cried, sweeping me up into a tight hug. She smelled different, like coffee and fresh bread instead of the greasy diner scent I was used to. "Oh, you should see the factory. It's amazing what they've done with it." Dad hung his jacket on the hook by the door, a wide smile on his face. "The equipment is state-of-the-art, all brand new. And they're serious about bringing the jobs back." There were at least 50 people there today, getting trained and filling out paperwork. "And the cafeteria is gorgeous," Mom added, setting her purse on the counter. "All stainless steel and new appliances. I get to design the menu myself, can you believe it?" Mr. Blackwood said he wants healthy options, but also comfort food that people will actually want to eat. Their enthusiasm was contagious. I peppered them with questions through dinner, pasta with actual meat sauce, a luxury we hadn't been able to afford in weeks, and they answered eagerly, talking over each other in their excitement. And guess what else? Dad said as he served himself a second helping. They're paying us weekly instead of bi-weekly to start, to help everyone get back on their feet. We'll have a paycheck on Friday. And there's health insurance, Mom added, her voice filled with relief. Good insurance, too. We can finally take you for that checkup Dr. Martinez has been reminding us about. The changes didn't stop there. By the end of the first week, we had paid our overdue rent and caught up on most of our bills. By the end of the second week, the refrigerator was fully stocked for the first time in months, and Mom had bought me new shoes to replace the ones I'd outgrown. Tommy's algebra tutor started coming on Tuesdays and Thursdays, a serious college student named Marcus who somehow made equations seem almost interesting. But the most significant change wasn't in our bank account or our pantry. It was in the atmosphere of our home. The tension that had hung in the air for so long, the barely suppressed worry, the whispered arguments after Tommy and I had gone to bed, the forced smiles that never quite reached my parents' eyes, had lifted like morning fog burning away in the sun. Dad whistled while he made breakfast. Mom laughed more easily. Tommy spent less time holed up in his room and more time in the living room with us, even suggesting family game nights like we used to have before everything fell apart. And I no longer felt the need to be invisibly good, to take up as little space and resources as possible. Even Mittens seemed to sense the shift. She grew plumper and more playful, chasing imaginary mice across the living room floor and batting at the new toys Mom had splurged on at the pet store. 1 month after that fateful day at the family fair, we celebrated with a special dinner. Mom made pot roast with actual vegetables, and Dad brought home a small cake from the bakery near the factory. As we sat around the table, I noticed little things I hadn't before, how the worry lines around Dad's eyes had softened, how Mom's hands no longer showed the painful redness from harsh diner cleaning chemicals, how Tommy sat up straighter and talked about maybe trying out for the basketball team next year. I propose a toast, Dad said, raising his glass of sparkling cider, a compromise for Tommy and me. To new beginnings. To new beginnings, we echoed, clinking our glasses together. Later that night, as I was getting ready for bed, there was a soft knock at my door. Mom entered, perching on the edge of my bed where Mittens was. Already curled up on my pillow. "Can we talk for a minute, sweetheart?" she asked, smoothing my hair back from my forehead. I nodded, sliding under the covers. "Am I in trouble?" "No, not at all," she assured me with a smile. "I just wanted to check in with you. A lot has changed these past few weeks, and I wanted to make sure you're doing okay with everything." I considered this for a moment. "I'm happy that you and Dad aren't sad anymore," I said finally. "And that we got to keep Mittens. And that Tommy isn't mad all the time." Mom nodded, her eyes soft in the dim light from my bedside lamp. "I'm happy about those things too. But you know what I'm most grateful for?" "What?" "Your bravery," she said, her voice catching slightly. "The way you were willing to give up something you loved so much to help our family. Not many grown-ups would have that kind of courage, let alone a 6-year-old girl." I felt my cheeks warm at her praise. I was really scared, I admitted. I didn't want to sell Mittens. "I know, baby. That's what makes it brave. Being scared, but doing the hard thing anyway." She stroked Mittens gently, and the cat purred in her sleep. "Mr. Blackwood saw that in you, I think. That's part of why he wanted to help us." The mention of Mr. Blackwood made me sit up slightly. "Have you seen him again?" "At the factory." Mom nodded. "He comes by once a week or so, checking on how things are progressing. He always asks about you and Mittens." This news made me happy in a way I couldn't quite explain. "He's nice," I said simply. "Yes, he is," Mom agreed. "And do you know something else? He started a program at the factory. For every employee, the company is donating money to the local animal shelter. They're calling it the Mittens Initiative." My eyes widened. "Really? They named it after Mittens?" Mom smiled. "Well, I think they named it after what Mittens represents, The idea that sometimes the things that seem the smallest can actually be the most important. I thought about this as I snuggled deeper under my covers. Mom, do you think Mr. Blackwood will ever get another cat? To replace Captain? A thoughtful look crossed Mom's face. I don't know, sweetie. Sometimes when people lose something they love very much, they're afraid to try again. They worry that nothing will ever measure up to what they lost, or that they'll just end up hurt again. That's sad, I murmured, instinctively hugging Mittens closer. It is, Mom agreed. But you know what? I think meeting you and Mittens might have helped him remember that some risks are worth taking. 2 days later, a package arrived at our apartment. It was addressed to me, which was unusual enough to cause excitement. Inside was a beautiful picture book about a girl and her cat who go on magical adventures together, and a note written in elegant handwriting. Dear Sarah, thank you for reminding me of an important lesson I had forgotten. Sometimes the greatest courage is found in the smallest hearts. I thought you might enjoy this book. The illustrator is a friend of mine who based the cat character on her own childhood pet. P.S. I visited the animal shelter yesterday. There's now a one-eyed black cat named Commodore living in my apartment. He's nothing like Captain, but I think that's probably a good thing. Warmest regards, Andrew Blackwood. Mom helped me write a thank you note, which I carefully illustrated with drawings of Mittens. We sent it to the factory address, along with a photo Tommy had taken of me and Mittens playing in the patch of sunlight that streamed through our living room window each afternoon. Spring melted into summer, and our lives continued to improve in small but significant ways. Dad received a promotion to senior production manager. Mom's cafeteria became so popular that they had to hire 2 assistants to help her keep up with demand. Tommy's grades improved enough that he qualified for the summer internship program at Blackwood Innovations, where he discovered an unexpected talent for computer programming. As for me, I started first grade with new clothes, a proper lunchbox, and the confidence that comes from knowing your family is on solid ground. When my teacher, Mrs. Hammond, asked us to draw pictures of our heroes for Parents' Night, I drew 2, Mittens on one side of the paper and Mr. Blackwood on the other. That's an interesting choice, Mrs. Hammond said when she saw my drawing. Most children draw superheroes or their parents. I considered this as I carefully colored in Mittens' gray fur. My parents are heroes too, I said thoughtfully. But Mittens and Mr. Blackwood changed everything. Mrs. Hammond looked confused, but she just smiled and moved on to the next student. Some stories were too complicated to explain to teachers who expected simple answers. Some heroes didn't wear capes or have special powers, but they changed lives all the same. That night, as I fell asleep with Mittens purring beside me, I thought about how differently things might have turned out if we hadn't gone to the family fair that day, if Mr. Blackwood hadn't walked by our table, if I hadn't been brave enough to try selling the thing I loved most. The journey from despair to hope wasn't always a straight line, but each step had led us here, to a place where tomorrow no longer loomed as a threat, but shimmered with promise. 20 years have passed since that day at Franklin Park, yet the memory remains as vivid as if it happened yesterday. I'm 26 now, sitting in my own apartment in Cambridge, watching the last golden rays of sunset paint the Charles River in shades of amber, the same color as Andrew Blackwood's eyes. Mittens lived to the impressive age of 17, remaining my faithful companion through elementary school, the awkward middle school years, and well into high school. When she finally passed, peacefully in her sleep on my bed during my senior year, I mourned her deeply but took comfort in the extraordinary life she'd lived, a life that, by all rights, should have taken a very different turn that fateful Saturday at the family fair. My parents still work for Blackwood Innovations, though their roles have evolved over the years. Dad is now the operations director for the entire Northeast region, overseeing 6 factories that employ over 2,000 people. Mom transitioned from cafeteria manager to employee wellness coordinator 5 years ago, developing programs that ensure workers have access to healthy food, exercise facilities, and mental health resources. They've moved from our tiny apartment to a modest but comfortable house in the suburbs, with a garden that Mom tends religiously and a workshop where Dad builds furniture on weekends. Tommy, or Tom, as he prefers now, graduated from MIT with a degree in computer science, supported in part by a Blackwood Innovations Scholarship. After interning with the company throughout college, he surprised everyone by turning down their job offer in favor of starting his own tech nonprofit focused on bringing STEM education to underserved communities. Andrew Blackwood was his first investor. And me? After completing my degree in veterinary medicine, I established a mobile clinic that provides low-cost care to pets in Boston's poorest neighborhoods. 3 days a week, I drive my converted van from community to community, treating beloved animals whose owners might otherwise be forced to make the same heartbreaking choice I nearly had to make with Mittens. The other 2 days, I work at the Franklin Park Animal Shelter, the same one that benefited from the Mittens initiative all those years ago. The van was a gift from Andrew, presented at my graduation with a simple card that read, "For Sarah, who understands the true value of companionship. May this help ensure no child has to choose between love and necessity." Andrew Blackwood remains a presence in our lives, though in varying degrees. He still meets Dad for lunch once a month to discuss factory operations and reminisce about the early days of the reopening. He attends the annual holiday party Mom organizes for employees and their families, always bringing thoughtful gifts for the children. He serves on the board of Tommy's nonprofit, offering guidance without overstepping. For me, our connection has evolved into a unique friendship that transcends our age difference and vastly different life experiences. 4 times a year, we meet for dinner at Danny's Diner, the same greasy spoon where our lives changed course 2 decades ago. Over coffee and pie, we catch up on each other's lives, share stories of the animals we've loved. Commodore lived to be 15, followed by a succession of shelter cats with increasingly nautical names, Admiral, Skipper, and now First Mate. And reflect on the strange symmetry of our paths. Do you ever think about how different life might have been? I asked him during our most recent dinner, watching as he methodically stirred cream into his coffee, always exactly 3 counterclockwise turns, a quirk I've observed over years of these meetings. He looked up, those amber eyes as sharp and perceptive as ever despite the new silver threading through his dark hair. "For you or for me?" "Both of us," I said. "If you hadn't been at the fair that day, if you hadn't seen me with Mittens, if you hadn't remembered selling Captain when you were a kid." Andrew was quiet for a moment, contemplating the question with the careful consideration he gave to all my inquiries, no matter how philosophical or seemingly trivial. "I think about it often," he admitted finally. Not in a regretful way, but with a sense of wonder at how profoundly our lives can be altered by what appear to be chance encounters. He took a thoughtful sip of his coffee. "Did I ever tell you I almost didn't go to the fair that day?" "No," I said, surprised. "Why not?" "I had a board meeting scheduled in New York. A last-minute thing that came up the night before. My assistant had already arranged the flight." A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. But that morning, I woke up with the strangest feeling, an inexplicable certainty that I needed to be in Boston at that fair. "Why?" I asked, fascinated by this new detail of a story I thought I knew by heart. He shrugged, but it was a thoughtful gesture rather than dismissive. I've asked myself that question many times over the years. The closest I've come to an answer is that perhaps some part of me, some deeper awareness, recognized an opportunity to heal an old wound. Not just for me, but for someone else. His words resonated with something I'd felt, but never articulated. "A cosmic balancing of accounts," I suggested. "Perhaps." He smiled fully now. "Or perhaps just a reminder that our past pain doesn't have to be meaningless if we can transform it into present compassion." Those words have stayed with me in the weeks since, echoing in my mind as I vaccinate puppies whose owners count out payment in carefully saved dollar bills, or when I treat elderly cats whose companions live on fixed incomes that barely cover their own medical needs. I've come to believe that the true measure of healing isn't forgetting our wounds, but using them as a map to find others who are hurting in familiar ways. My childhood experience of almost losing Mittens didn't disappear when Andrew Blackwood entered our lives. It transformed into a sensitivity that now guides my work, helping me recognize the silent desperation in a parent's eyes when they bring in a beloved pet they fear they can no longer afford to keep. Last week, a young mother came to my mobile clinic with a scruffy terrier mix and 2 small children. The worry etched on her face was painfully familiar, the same look I'd seen on my own mother's face all those years ago. As I examined the dog, I noticed the older child, a girl of about 6, watching me with solemn eyes, her arms wrapped protectively around the terrier's neck. "He's got an ear infection," I explained after the examination, "and he needs his vaccines updated. But he's otherwise healthy." The mother's face fell at the implied cost. "How much will it be?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled, though I could hear the tremor beneath. "Actually," I said, meeting the little girl's eyes, "we have a special program for families who deeply love their pets. It's called the Mittens Fund. It covers treatment for cases just like this." "Mittens," the little girl repeated, curiosity momentarily overriding her concern. "Like kitten mittens?" "Sort of," I smiled, preparing the first injection while keeping my voice casual. "Mittens was my cat when I was about your age. I almost had to give her away because my family couldn't afford to keep her. But someone helped us, and now I get to help other families stay together with their pets." As I worked, I told them a simplified version of my story. The mother's eyes filled with tears of relief and recognition, while the children listened with the rapt attention that only a true story can command. "So Mittens got to stay with you forever?" the younger child asked when I finished. "For her whole life," I confirmed, giving the terrier a final pat. "And now Buddy here can stay with you for his whole life too." As they left, the mother clasped my hand tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "You don't know what this means to us." But I did know, with a bone-deep certainty that comes only from lived experience. I knew exactly what it meant to love something with your whole heart and face losing it to circumstances beyond your control. I knew the peculiar blend of fear and determined hope that comes from being a child caught in adult problems. And I knew the profound impact that unexpected kindness can have, rippling outward in ways that even the giver might never fully comprehend. That evening, I sent Andrew a text, something I rarely do outside our scheduled meetings. "Met a family today. Little girl with her dog. Reminded me of me and Mittens. Use the fund. Thought you'd want to know the ripples continue." His response came quickly. "The best investments always do. See you next month, Captain Sarah." I smiled at the nickname, a play on my last name, Thompson, and his childhood pet that he'd started using in recent years. Outside my window, the last light faded from the sky, stars emerging one by one above the city. Somewhere in Boston, a little girl was going to bed with her dog beside her, perhaps whispering secrets into his fur the way I once did with Mittens. 20 years ago, I stood at a family fair with a cardboard sign and a breaking heart, unaware that my small personal tragedy was about to collide with someone else's long-ago pain in a way that would reshape both our futures. I couldn't have understood then how profound the impact would be, how the simple act of trying to sell my cat would set in motion events that would not only change my family's immediate circumstances, but alter the trajectory of all our lives. Now, as an adult looking back, I see that day not as the lowest point of my childhood, but as the beginning of understanding something essential about what connects us as human beings. We are bound together not just by our joys and triumphs, but by our sorrows and struggles, by the moments when we stand exposed in our vulnerability, offering up our most precious treasures because we see no other choice. In those moments, when we are most broken and afraid, we are also most open to the transformative power of compassion. Andrew Blackwood didn't just save my cat or give my parents jobs. He showed me that our darkest experiences don't have to define us or limit us. They can become the very foundation upon which we build lives of meaning and purpose. As I prepare for bed, I glance at the framed photo on my nightstand, a slightly faded image of a small girl with a gray tabby cat sitting in a patch of sunlight. Beside it stands a newer picture, me in my white coat, standing beside my mobile clinic with Andrew at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, both of us beaming with pride. From selling a beloved pet to providing care for thousands of animals, from a chance encounter at a community fair to a lasting friendship built on mutual respect and shared values. From the depths of childhood despair to a life dedicated to preventing that same pain in others. These are the unexpected journeys that reveal the remarkable resilience of the human spirit and the incalculable impact of compassion offered at exactly the right moment. As I drift toward sleep, I find myself grateful not just for the happy ending to my particular story, but for the privilege of creating similar turning points for others. Each day brings new opportunities to be the person Andrew Blackwood was for me, to recognize moments when a small intervention might alter someone's entire future. To remember that sometimes the most important thing we can offer another person is not material assistance, but the simple recognition of their struggle and the affirmation of their worth. 20 years from now, perhaps that little girl with her terrier will tell someone her own story of the day a traveling vet saved her beloved dog, and how it changed her understanding of what's possible in a world that sometimes seems indifferent to individual suffering. Perhaps she too will find ways to transform her moment of vulnerability into a lifetime of meaningful action. This, I've come to believe, is how healing happens, not in isolated incidents of good fortune, but in continuous chains of compassion that link us across time and circumstance, reminding us that no pain need be wasted if it awakens in us the capacity to ease another's burden. In this way, even our deepest wounds become not scars but bridges, connecting us to each other through the shared experience of what it means to be human, to love, to lose, to fear, to hope, and ultimately, to find purpose in reaching back to lift others along the path we've traveled.